This is Dateline News and Conversation. There's a lot to talk about, an awful lot going on. We're going to sharpen the focus tonight. We're going to focus on Donald Trump. First up, we're going to talk about the United Nations Security Council endorsing his plan for Gaza. And this one really disturbed me. Joe Laria, the editor of Consortium News, wrote this article this morning, and I knew we just had to talk about this. We're also going to talk about that little Epstein thing that just won't go away, is haunting Donald Trump. And then I also want to talk about the related subject. You know, there was a big deal made about Trump brokering this ceasefire and a peace deal between Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Palestine, Gaza. It's all very confusing. My guest tonight, incredible journalist, radio host, Don DeBar. He's located in the New York City area up in Westchester County. Don, welcome back to the show.
Hey, my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Regis. Good to see you, man.
All right. First of all, can you explain to me what the implications are of this UN Security Council vote? It wasn't unanimous because Russia and China abstained.
Right.
And I want to dig down deep into this with you, Don, because I don't get it. I don't really understand what it means that he's going to have kind of a neo-colonial governing board over the territory to build a fantasy resort, depopulate the area, and then I don't understand why Russia and China didn't veto it. They just abstained. Don, help me understand what's going on, because I don't get it.
I mean, there's so many moving parts, it's hard to know where to start. And, they're moving through space and time. We didn't just wake up today and find ourselves here. There's a history that brought us here. And there's a whole world, literally, of other machinations that are going on that just takes place within the context of involving the United States, Europe, Russia, China, Japan, Korea, and others, of course, most of the rest of the world. The Security Council right now, as it always has, in one fashion or another since the Second World War, when the UN was created, has 5 permanent members: China, France, the Russian Federation, once the Soviet Union, the UK, and the United States. They are permanent members, and they have the right to, what word used is veto, but to kill any proposed action or any vote on any proposed action by the Security Council. The Security Council is charged with maintaining international peace and security. It's the only legal, for the members of the United Nations, entity that can examine the questions of war and peace and make a decision that involves, using military action. Of course, we know there are lots of people lots of players around the world that have taken many military actions without the permission or sanction or blessing of the UN Security Council since 1945. I would say the largest serial violator of that by far would be the United States. There's those 5 permanent members, again, China, France, Russia, UK, and the United States, and then 10 non-permanent members from various regions around the world who are elected for 2-year terms by the General Assembly. So we have Algeria, whose 2-year term ends this year. Denmark, whose 2-year term began this year, will end next year. Likewise with Greece, which will end next year. Guyana, which will end this year. Pakistan, which will end next year. Panama, which will end next year. The Republic of Korea, which is South Korea, as we call it, which ends this year. Sierra Leone, which ends this year, Slovenia ends this year, and Somalia, which ends next year. So you have, countries from North Africa, Scandinavia, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the Indian Peninsula, Korea, from East Asia, Africa, and East Europe, and East Africa. So these are the members of the Security Council. All of them, with the exception of Russia and China, voted to approve this measure yesterday. Russia and China, rather than vetoing it, blocking it from being implemented, chose finally to just abstain and allow it to be passed without approving it. Why would they do that? Well, it is 3 years now, 2 years that this bombing the hell out of Gaza has been going on. Geez, when did 2023? Yeah, so this 2 years of death rained down on Gaza. In the most recent presentation of it, within the context of I don't know how much death has been rained down on Gaza, say since 2006, when the Israelis supposedly ended their occupation of it, and Hamas was elected as the government of Gaza by the people of Gaza. Israel did not like that, and so they put on a blockade, made it impossible to get almost everything, food, concrete to repair the buildings they had blown up the last time they took it, crayons, all kinds of things that normal societies are allowed to have and produce and enjoy in the 21st century. Well, I don't know, let's see. So you've had somewhere between 25 and 50% of the housing destroyed, maybe more than that. 100 to 200,000 or 300,000 people murdered out of a population before this latest episode of somewhere around 2 to 2.2 million people. Hospitals gone, electric and heating and water and sewage infrastructure pretty much gone. People herded into prison camps that are moved around as the Israeli military comes in and picks people out and kills them on the spot. And all of this supposedly in a search for a group, a paramilitary group that they hold responsible for what happened in October of 2023. There have been many proposals made at the UN Security Council, which has shown itself to be useless as a mechanism for defending people against genocide, as this genocide has been imposed on the people of Gaza. Perhaps the Security Council has prevented thermonuclear war to this point, but shy of that, it really hasn't accomplished much else. And I think that there's an acknowledgement and understanding by the people involved that there's going to be nothing else offered to the people of Gaza other than this method of stopping them from getting shot on sight, where an international force, and by the way, this isn't the first time that international players have been introduced there with the hope that they would act as buffers, but the hope is that an international force would not impose the same hell on the people of Gaza that the Israelis have, and that from there they could build out. I don't think anyone expects this to even hold, but no one's offering anything else. I mean, you have to go pull out for a minute and look at the fact that the United States has said that they support the Israeli government, and look at the situation, the political condition inside the United States, where you have these two masses of competing interests for power, if that's to be believed, or one mass. I mean, those are our choices, really. Either Trump is an oppositional force to the so-called deep state and his power rests heavily on AIPAC, etc., as does the others, because AIPAC's been in charge long before Trump showed up in Washington, D.C., and they didn't abandon anybody. The roll call for AIPAC in Congress hasn't changed. There's maybe 3 people not on it. So, either you're going to have a military confrontation with the United States if you propose a military solution to Israel's military destruction of the people of Gaza, or you attempt to somehow at least take the boot off the neck long enough for people to catch their breath and stand up. I don't know whether to even call this a ceasefire, really. I really don't know what to call it other than respite, if that's possible. Russia and China have expressed their displeasure with it, and they really also have expressed the reality of the fact that this is not the place to draw a line in the sand for a military confrontation with the U.S. Those are the conditions we're working within. And so all of the people that have a problem with this, I'm open to hear their proposals on how to get from here to there.
Don, I want to jump in. Do you think the reason Russia and China just abstained, because I think, as you said, they don't see this being very successful. They probably realize it's going to fall apart.
Yeah,
do you think that might be Yeah.
They see it as another teaching moment, I think. That the people have to catch up to what's going on. The world is changing so rapidly. Even if there wasn't this huge fog of propaganda between events and the people, the things are changing so rapidly, and that fog that gets lifted is so dense and so thick and has so befuddled the masses of people around the world that it's going to take time for them to catch up. I'm not trying to say that that's how it should be, or to explain it or treat it as something good, but it's a fact. If Trump were to side with the Palestinians, he'd be out of office in 2 minutes here.
Yeah.
There'd be a vote of no confidence in the Congress of some kind and an emergency meeting of this, and who knows who in the office would just walk up to him and shoot him in the face. I don't know what it would be. And not because it's Trump. Anybody in that office, that's what would happen to them at this moment. Ask Kennedy about that, JFK about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say it'd be a JFK event.
Exactly.
They'd remove him really quickly and publicly.
The only difference would be perhaps no one would have any questions about where did Trump's brain go.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Trump's plan clearly stated basically to depopulate this area and to build a luxury resort on the Mediterranean. And if I'm not mistaken, it was reported months ago that Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, had this fantasy, this wet dream about building a resort on the Mediterranean. I thought at the time, this is absolutely insane. But on the other hand, it was an indication of what these guys are thinking. I mean, Trump, I can't imagine. He must be thinking he'd have a Trump Tower on the Mediterranean and a golf course that would be part of the World Golf Tour or the PGA or whatever it is. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, that is just, to me, it's so obnoxious.
Well, see, and then let's look at the reality of it. He comes out of New York real estate, okay? That's, what people have been trying to do with Harlem and Bed-Stuy and, all over New York City, all these, places that have been, where those who had nowhere else to go ended up basically. Those folks have been slowly, or sometimes not so slowly, moved out, and a wrecking ball comes in, and they build new stuff. Luxury condominiums being the preferred, replacement product. Trump comes out of a city that's done that to, hundreds and hundreds of, Manhattan has got a population about the same as Gaza, 2.2 million or 2 million or 2.5 million, whatever. And they call it gentrification here, but it's the same process. You displace the population, you scrape the land, and you build your luxury things that are intended to draw top dollar rent and or resale. A resort on the Mediterranean next to Israel, the entire Jewish middle class in the United States and Europe, aside from, everybody else. This is, look at all those, how many Christian land, amusement parks do you think they could build there with, walking to Galilee with Jesus and all that? This is prime real estate by any measure, and the people handling it are used to displacing the people who are the indigenous or non-indigenous, but the people who are occupying that property right now as their home and scraping the ground and building to suit. So I'm not surprised at all. I'm surprised it hasn't happened 20 or 30 or 50 years ago.
Let me ask you this. I know you must be questioning, shocked, angry that the rest of the world, especially their Arab and Muslim brothers, have not put an end to this. I mean, it's angered me to no end, and I know a lot of other people that nobody has seemed to be able to do anything to stop Israel and really the United States. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, come to New York. Take a look at real estate financing in New York. You'll see some of the largest fundraisers for Israel are in real estate in New York. The head of the JNF, for example, the Jewish National Fund, is a developer and landlord in New York City, and he's one among many. Look at the investments of the Saudis and others in Manhattan in real estate and in terms of financing the investment of others. This is a bed that everyone sleeps in, and this bed more or less pulls the strings of the people in Washington, who in turn fund the aircraft carrier, and that's where they keep the trailers and the tractors and all of the equipment that they then take in, and the entire state of Palestine has been under redevelopment and gentrification, quote unquote, since since the 1890s and 1910 and whatever, before Balfour even, so this is something that sort of accelerates the time.
I want to ask you another huge question about New York City, because it's made headlines around the world. This Zoran Mamdani comes out of nowhere to get elected, and I didn't follow it closely, but I've read a couple of articles where he had tens of thousands of young volunteers that went door to door and were using social media, and these power brokers that you're talking about had spent supposedly millions of dollars to try to defeat him. In your mind, what does that mean, Don? That this guy comes in out of nowhere? Is he going to be able to do anything, or really are these powerful people and brokers going to just snuff this guy and render him, incapable of doing anything? Tell me about that.
He's a straw man or a Pied Piper. The people flocking to him show that the soil is rich. The people are ready for what he's saying. He was allowed to say it because those sitting on top see that they need to let some steam out of this, because there's their situation. They can hear off in the distance the rumbling. The working class in the United States has been, being pauperized really on a steady beat, at least since Nixon. And it's, that this is the kind of thing that gathers and, gets more intense over time, and more intensive over time. And, the statistics that we hear, bandied back and forth all the time now about half the people don't have $1,000 in an emergency, and whatever the head count is for properties in foreclosure and eviction, and things that don't even get tied to that in the public discourse, but the acquisition of privately owned housing by BlackRock and Vanguard and others, where they've built pretty much already, sort of a 21st century feudalism, where the land is going to be owned in a very, very tightly concentrated manner, more so than ever in history, as a matter of fact. And the people are so detached from production at this point already. They're almost irrelevant to production with AI now, at least it seems. There's a lot of little wrinkles in that model, because why bother doing all that if there's no consumers or something? But if they can keep a small or whatever size reserve army they want to keep on land that they own and control, to service production that they own and control, they're not so far off of that already. And see, the path to there has come with shedding or the stripping of a lot of power from the lower, from the working class and poor people and the middle class, which has almost evaporated. So I look, I really don't know how to put this into like a framework that people can understand without having some macro discussion. But the working people have been getting their asses kicked for so long and lied to about who was excuse me, who's going to do what for whom for decades now. That they're desperate. We saw in 1999 what happened in Seattle, the spontaneous uprising almost at the what was the gathering there, the IMF or whoever it was that was there. And then we saw the Occupy Wall Street spread like wildfire across the United States and Western Europe and East Asia, Japan and Korea and such. We've seen the collapses that have taken place. The .com bubble, the 2008 collapse, all these different things that have happened. Again, we could go back to the stagflation of Ford and Carter and whatnot. There have been no paths out for people, and a complete disillusionment in the institutions. They've lost all legitimacy to half the population, the Democratic constituents, quote unquote, whatever, think that any election where a Republican wins, the election was stolen. The other half, when the Republicans think that when a Democrat wins, the election was stolen. In other words, at any given time, half the people believe that the elections are not valid just as a head count. Okay. And as a matter of fact, studying it with any, cursory look at it, they're both right. And so, there's a sense of both resignation maybe that settles in with it, but also a sense that as things get more desperate, they've got to start looking somewhere else for a resolution. We saw, Trump comes out of being basically a game show host to president, in like 10 minutes. And Sanders comes out of the little corner store in Burlington, Vermont or whatever, to almost being president, based on this condition that existed in the electorate, that people have pretty much given up on the way things had been being done. And this is what they call pre-revolutionary condition, that the rulers cannot rule in the ways they've ruled, and the ruled will not be ruled in the ways they've been ruled. And so we're starting to come to a point like that where people felt, well, just going to vote for Hillary Clinton or just going to vote for Mitt Romney or whatever ain't going to cut it anymore. I don't give a flying, what, about abortion rights or this, that, or the other thing. I need a job. I need a future for my kids. I need some hope, not just hopium, but actual, opportunities that are in front of me that I could put my hands on. And so, people are looking around here for that big time. I
And
might be a
so,
little far afield, but
no, I think you're right on. I been talking a lot about on these shows about the economic condition in the United States and how the middle class is basically almost shrunk to nothing. You know, they beginning with Clinton, he started shipping jobs to Mexico, then to China, then all over Asia. So there's nothing left for people that don't want to be in a middle class to be able to have any hope for. And they've destroyed the unions. So as you mentioned, the 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 working class, they don't have the means of, they don't have production anymore. They're not involved in it. So as you mentioned, we're looking at a form of neo-feudalism, which will probably be worse than it ever was. But I just wanted to explore that, what was really happening in New York City. And it comes back to the same thing. It's the same very small group of very powerful forces uh, that basically control everything, and they fight amongst each other every once in a while. But then in the end, they're raking it in, and it's a war economy that Eisenhower warned about, and that doesn't look like it's going to go away. I want to continue talking about Trump because,
can I pile on here for one last thing to summarize
yeah,
that?
of course you can. It's your show.
So, one of the things about this guy, his pitch when he was campaigning was a pitch to tenants in particular. The history of that in New York City, either you have an apartment, in this, the hub of, certainly Western Hemisphere, and saves maybe the Western economy. You either live in an apartment or you are homeless. There's not a lot of places where you can set up a tent, or go out in the woods or whatever, or build a little house. And this has been a problem as the city was developed over the certainly over the 19th and 20th century. You have a situation where the law evolved more or less for tenant protections in New York City and other places like that, these urban centers in the United States particularly, because the exploitation of tenants was so intensive. The living conditions were so horrible, and the contrast, the contradiction with the available resources was so intensive that people basically forced it. And so you ended up with a situation where there was almost, and there wasn't actually, as a matter of fact, much public housing, socialized housing for millions of people in New York City, or hundreds of thousands in any event, directly publicly owned, and heavy duty regulation of privately owned housing in the city. What they called rent control actually included eviction protections and a number of other landlord-tenant legal strictures. You could not raise someone's rent more than a very minute percent from year to year for any reason. You could not evict a tenant because you didn't like them or because you found somebody else that would pay you more. These laws lasted from before the Second World War up until about 1970, as a matter of fact, as did an immense stock of publicly owned housing. In fact, the New York City Housing Authority was, I think, at one point in time, maybe the largest landlord in the world outside of the socialist bloc. This was an insult to the speculative model preferred by the temple of speculation on Wall Street, which is part of New York City also. And so by 1974, the entire block of these protections was removed and replaced with what they called rent stabilization and public-private partnerships. So what you ended up going first, there were many interim steps. They started starving the maintenance budgets of the public housing and allowing theft of the maintenance and other materials. So here's an apartment building with 80 units in it. Was built in 1930. Every 10 years we replace the windows and the burners and whatever. They start disappearing. Some of these buildings by 1965 are empty concrete shells with heroin addicts living in them and such. And this becomes the face of public housing against real estate ads in the same newspapers showing luxury apartments, and sometimes where the public housing stood 2 years, 3, 5, 10 years ago. The protections for tenants went from rent control to rent stabilization. There was a bugaboo that inflation had made it impossible to be a landlord because you could only increase the rent 2% no matter what, or whatever the number would be for that year. But there was a 10% inflation rate, so our oil prices went up and our salaries and maintenance went up. And so not only am I not making money on this building anymore, but I can't afford to pay the mortgage or the taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So by the middle of the 1970s, you had, instead of rent guidelines board consisting of half tenants, quote unquote, handpicked by the city, and half landlords who picked the people in the city doing the picking. And that they set what the rent increases would be. And the new housing that replaced public housing, which was just knocked down all over the place, was essentially a private housing with private landlords and quasi-public agencies funding it. In other words, the people would guarantee loans made by Chase or other banks, and whether they defaulted or not, we would end up writing a check. The people would end up writing a big check somewhere. That money would end up in the pocket of the bankers and the landlords and the developers, and some shoddy housing would get built that was privately owned, and then at some point in time managed by nonprofits. So this model is what this guy stepped into 50 years later. And we went through these 70s, more through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s of intensive gentrification across the city, particularly, though, in the poorer neighborhoods. You can walk blocks of Harlem now and not see a black person, for example. But you see a lot of really nice brownstones with all kinds of yuppified characters strolling in and out. The guy walks into this scene promising to address the concerns of these people who, by the way, are still alive and living in the shadows somewhere and struggling. He's the first voice to speak for them publicly. But what he says, other than hopium, like Obama style, has nothing to do with the actual necessary moves. First of all, you have to change the legislative environment immediately. And the only way to do that is to have the New York State legislature approve it, because the laws that govern the New York City rent controls environment or rent stabilization environment were taken away from the city into the hands of the state as a part of this process in the 60s and 70s. And therefore, you have to have state legislation in order to make any changes. The devil in that detail is that New York State consists of New York City, down here, about that big, and then New York State, about that big. Half the population is here in this little area, and half the population is here spread across the state of New York. This is Democratic, this is Republican. These people are tenants. These people, until recently, have been homeowners. And so their state legislators, the majority of state legislators outside of the city, almost the absolute group of state legislators, are not going to amend New York City's rent control laws to protect against landlords. So he hasn't addressed any of that. So the minute he started talking, I knew he was full of, you know what. And when we found out some of the people that had funded him, and when we saw some of the people that came out and backed him early on, it was clear that he is, in fact, a Pied Piper, like AOC and the others. Again, we'll go back to the little bit recent history from 1999 down to 2008 and Occupy Wall Street and, 2016 election. And here we are. What do? Well, we better do something. Let's give them a tenant's hero. And that's what he is. But he's not. He's a landlord shill.
Wow. Well, that was some education for me because I had no idea what was going on. I wondered whether he was going to be like an Obama, hope you can believe in. But anyway, thanks for that.
I got to tag it with this. So when you see him and Trump banging heads, think about that within the context I just gave you. Two real estate guys from New York, basically, or one real estate guy's, the real estate guy's boy and a real estate guy. He's also the real estate guy's boy, by the way.
Okay, if you don't mind, I want to move on, but I want to talk about the real estate guy, Donald Trump. He seems to be in a world of hurt right now with this Epstein thing that just won't go away.
Yeah.
And it's in the news now, even internationally. Even where I am, you get an article here and there about Epstein, and of course, everybody. There isn't anybody anywhere in Europe or where I am and in Russia that isn't asking and talking about Trump. He's 24 cycle, top of the news every single day. So, what's your take on this little Epstein thing?
Well, I mean, how many times did we go to the well with that, right? And I've got a personal angle on that too, because the guy they put in a cage with him before he hung himself or whatever happened, before he died, was a cop from Briarcliff Manor, which is the next town over from where I am, named Nick Tartaglione. And some say Nick Tartaglione was in the federal pen, sharing a cell for a minute or two with Epstein, because he had been charged with and convicted of 4 death penalty murders, killing and disassembling 4 cocaine dealing colleagues and burying them upstate. And he was waiting for sentencing while he was in with Epstein. And then after Epstein died, his sentence came down and he did not get death penalty in any of those cases. So that, to me, that's the most salient fact. This cop was someone that a local public access producer, who I knew personally, as a matter of fact, who I videotaped in the hospital after this incident, was beaten to within an inch of his life by this cop in Ossining, Briarcliff, on Scarborough Beach in Briarcliff Manor. And he won an $800,000 award, as a matter of fact, for the beating that he got, named Clay Tiffany. Look, it appears that a lot of young women, underage women, and maybe men, I don't know, the salient details of stuff like this don't really interest me. The damage to humans interests me a great deal. But a lot of people had, all kinds of bad things done to them, sex pressured on them, rape, whatever they call impressed prostitution, whatever. And in service to or at the service of the rich and powerful. Apparently, that's the case. Every prominent politician that I'm aware of has been linked to this guy in one fashion or another. The big banks in the West, J.P. Morgan Chase and Citibank, if I'm not mistaken, I could be mistaken, but I believe, have both been demonstrated to have been doing what they're charged is money laundering. In other words, the money being paid by people that ends up in Epstein's hands so that one of these young victims ends up in the maker's hands, was funneled through some of these banks in international transactions. And association with this guy is politically toxic when it's brought front and center in the media, which happens and waxes and wanes in the media depending on other things. You know, there's a movie that was made in, I think, 2002 by someone who was inside the presidential palace in Caracas, Venezuela, when there was an attempted coup against Hugo Chavez. And it was about the coup. And this movie displayed sort of the media that was being published, produced, distributed before, during, and after the seizure of power, and then the return of power to President Chavez. That had shown me something that I didn't really understand before, viscerally anyway. And that is that when you're going to seize power, it is not, the illusion that we have, of a band of merry men and women, grabbing a sword or, small arms or whatever, Uzis, and running into the halls of power and grabbing the microphone. It doesn't work like that at all. Instead, the institutions themselves are seized one at a time or manipulated to present a picture of normalcy as the change takes place. And so whenever there's some international fracture point, some major contradiction seems to be about to present itself, whether in and around Ukraine, China and Taiwan, Korea, North Africa, Venezuela, elsewhere. I could go down a long list. Epstein ends up in the paper again, and one or the other of the parties that are going to be on either side of this thing that's coming up, are demanding to release the Epstein files. And with the intimation, not even the intimation, with everyone's understanding being that guy that wants to make peace with Ukraine, or that guy that wants to let China have Taiwan or whatever, that they personally slept with Epstein's 8-year-old cousin or whatever. And so this never comes out, of course. None of this ever comes. The actual facts of it come out. We get these dumps of data. Meanwhile, you have very sympathetic. Look, let's look at what happened with, the Me Too movement, quote unquote. It's a movement like a bowel movement, okay? It's a TV show. When they talk about a movement, there's a production that goes across the TV channels, which are actually all part of the same media operations. They have the 6 entities, or if they're 4 or whatever the hell they are now, have all kinds of cross contracts and distribution and everything else. Anyway, this mass here, are the audience that they talk to, and they have an objective when they do so. And so whatever it is in terms of presentation that's going to make their presentation effective, that's what we get. This is presented to us in a way that it becomes a factor in making a determination about the big real thing that's being decided at the moment. So the question of whether or not to prosecute the Comey or the Attorney General in New York or whatever, somehow Epstein falls into it on one side or the other. And we're seeing that now with a number of things that are in the air. And the Democrats all of a sudden want the release of Epstein because they think they're going to find a page in there they found a page in there with Trump's name on it. And so if Trump says, let's pull out of Ukraine, they're going to say they're going to send him, 6 Ukrainian 10-year-olds or whatever. The 8 years, the 4 years that Biden was president, and the 8 years that Obama was president, and the multiple years that the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, as if that was necessary to release this stuff, by the way, which it wasn't. Biden could have released it the same way Trump can, the same way that Obama could have, and they didn't. There's the records that made their way into the trial folders. You can see some of that stuff on the court archives, Pacer. But, this is ginned. It's engineered as an adjunct to what the real purpose of the media, what their messaging is supposed to be about today. I'm not sure I know what that is. I mean, we've got this deal that's trying to sell in Gaza. We've got Russia sweeping into, new territory in Donbass and elsewhere in East Ukraine. In other words, a rout of the Ukrainians again. You've got a foiled false flag attempt by Ukrainians against Poland, intending to start a war between Poland and either Belarus or Russia proper. You've got all of the things that are going on in Africa right now. Where do you want me to begin? And you've got the thing that's being ginned up between Japan and China right now. And you look at what Trump has done that was different in some of those areas. I would pick, for example, with respect to Japan and China, the move with Kim Jong-un to almost do a peace treaty with DPRK, with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. Looking at this as a sort of an interval period in a global realignment that maybe ends up in a simplification of it in the three great sheaths of George Orwell, the Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. I think it's more complex than that. But if you look at the attempt to settle business between Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan in the same context that you look at the attempt to assert dominance over Venezuela, you can see like a quid pro quo suggesting itself. I'm not talking now morality. I'm not even suggesting anyone should do this, but these forces are in motion and these things are presenting themselves. And I'm not the only person to notice it, obviously. The people who are engineering it, I'm sure, also notice. So, it may be, for example, Trump's preference was to, I think, see a unification of Korea. You got to look at the history of Korea, at least from the beginning of the 20th century, with the Japanese occupation of much of it, and then the Koreans pushing it back, and then the surrender of Japan, the unconditional surrender of Japan to the United States in 1945, which basically put the U.S. in charge of Japan and its tributaries, its occupied property, quote unquote. And what happened in South Korea, as we call it, was that the Japanese occupation remained, but it was first put under command of MacArthur and the U.S. military. And then the Japanese troops were turfed out in favor of American troops. And so it became an American colony instead of a Japanese colony. And it became a foil to both Japan and China in Asia, at least potentially. It became also useful in the development of capital in Asia by doing what Japan had been doing and taking advantage of the labor markets in Korea to develop capital in Japan. But the capital in Japan was now being siphoned off to New York, or well, a lot of it to New York. This whole thing is very complex. And what we're looking at with stuff like Epstein is basically PR tools to help explain a narrative that helps actually accomplish different things on the ground, such as the realignment of forces, of economies, of political systems, of all of that geostrategic stuff.
So the Epstein thing is just a little distraction that pops in and out, like a jack in a box. Whenever it has to, they need it, it pops up.
It's a horror, of course. It's a horror for however many women were involved, 50, 100, 1,000, I don't know. But, compare that horror, if you can do these things, because people try to compare holocausts, like, really? Compare that horror to the horror that we just saw in Gaza for, say, children 12 and under. It's ongoing, by the way. Nobody's talking about putting those papers in anybody's hands. Every member of that Congress that's got something to say about who's blocking what about Epstein hasn't got a goddamn thing to say about who's blocking what about who's culpable for murdering all those children, 100,000 or 50,000 of them. It's a matter of prioritizing reality also.
Yeah. Well, Don, I can't thank you enough. It's a very lucid explanation of a lot of things that are going on in the world, what happened in New York, what's happening in Gaza in the Middle East, what's happening between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, and China and Taiwan. It's a mess. I got to have you back as soon as we can, Don. Always appreciate your insight.
I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, brothers. It's my pleasure to speak with you, and I hope you stay well.